If the West does not put pressure on America, if the global South does not stand up in the United Nations and support these people, there could be as much as 2.1 plus 4, that's 6, plus 1 in Israel, 7 million Palestinians who will find themselves ethnically cleansed, without rights, and refugees.
In fact, those terms, ethnically cleansed and genocide, are part of the language you use in your speech. You do believe this is ethnic cleansing. You do believe this is genocide.
It's certainly ethnic cleansing, that's absolutely clear. The term genocide is more contested, and I didn't use it, I have to say, for the first couple of years, because genocide implies the wiping out of an entire people. But that's now a term I do use, and it's now clearly the policy of Netanyahu's government to expel and get rid of the entire Palestinian population. I was very disappointed to see India swing into a more pro-Israel position at a time when Israel is very plausibly accused of committing a major genocide and is apparently preparing to ethnically cleanse up to 6 or 7 million people from its land.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. My guest today believes that Israel's treatment of Gaza and the Palestinian people is one of the great moral catastrophes of our time. As he puts it, it's arguably the biggest moral failure of the West since the Second World War. He said this in an outspoken and powerful speech in London 6 weeks ago. Since then, it's gone viral. In a moment, I'm going to play the full 5-minute speech for you. And after that, I want to introduce you to my guest, the well-known and highly regarded author, historian, broadcaster, and critic, William Dalrymple. Mr. Dalrymple has lived in the Middle East in the mid-1990s and is considering writing a second book on the Palestinian people. His first book from the Middle East was called From the Holy Mountain. He'll be with us in a moment's time, but first, listen to his speech.
"77 years ago this month, 750,000 Palestinians were terrorized, raped, and brutalized out of their homes and farms and villages in the Galilee, from Tiberias, Bet Shean, Safed, and the great Palestinian ports of Jaffa and Acre. They were driven out with napalm and machine guns and machetes and forced to flee from their olive trees onto the barren sand dunes of Gaza, where they remain. At the end of 1948, less than 15% of Palestinians remained where they had always lived. 85% had been ethnically cleansed, despite the promises of Lord Balfour that, quote, "nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine." The Nakba happened because the politicians of this country enabled it. They enabled it with the Balfour Declaration, and they enabled it with 30 years of British colonial rule in Palestine, during which the indigenous inhabitants were disarmed and their leaders arrested and sent to prison camps outside the country. This country has a historic responsibility, more than virtually any other, to see the establishment of a Palestinian state and to provide some protection for the Palestinian people who have suffered what they did because our grandparents' generations regarded the Palestinians as somehow expendable and unimportant. You might have thought that this shameful history would galvanize our government to atone for past mistakes and make good for past failures. Far from it. For our leaders do not know the history of the sufferings of the Palestinians because their story is not taught in our schools. The BBC is too frightened to tell their stories in documentaries or news bulletins. The British people are not taught the dark history of our responsibility for this mess. Instead, we as a country still provide diplomatic cover for Netanyahu's extremist administration, which has made its intentions entirely clear. Smotrich, Netanyahu's finance minister, said last week on television, Gaza will be entirely destroyed, and its population will leave in great numbers to third countries. Yet this government has done nothing. It is complicit with the most public and visible of war crimes. Our taxpayers' money is still being used to send the RAF to assist the genocide in Gaza with British-gathered intelligence, to enable the murderers to kill yet more women and children with aircraft parts made in this country and freely exported to the IDF. Shamefully, more weapons for the IDF have left Britain under Starmer than under the Tories. At this moment, 500,000 Palestinians are facing starvation. 1 million others can barely get enough food. Human Rights Watch has said that Israel's blockade has transcended military tactics to become a tool of extermination. But you cannot suppress the truth. Everyone here in this church tonight knows about this slaughter. More than 60,000 innocents have been killed, and maybe as many as 100,000. This is one of the great moral catastrophes of our time, arguably the biggest moral failure of the West since the Second World War. There is darkness all around us as we wake every morning to see images of yet more slaughtered innocents on our phones. It sometimes feels like this darkest of nights will never end. Yet it is in that darkness that we dream best. And our dreams are not fantasy, they are an urgent reality. We dream of justice and freedom and dignity and decency and human rights. We dream of a world where Palestinians are not burnt alive in their tents. We dream of a world where they are not herded like cattle from refugee camp to await their final slaughter. We dream of a Palestinian state supported by our government, where Palestinians can live in safety and without fear. We dream of freedom for Palestine. Thank you.
William Dalrymple, that was an incredibly powerful speech. So let me start by asking, what made you speak out in this way in London?
I've always been obsessed about the injustices done to the Palestinians. And although most of your listeners, Karan, I think will know me as someone that's written about Indian history, there was a point in the mid-90s when I moved to Jerusalem and used that as a base to travel through Greece, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt, as well as Israel and Palestine. And at that point, I was writing a book on the Middle Eastern Christians, this minority that we often forget about. It's particularly forgotten, I think, that 10% of Palestinians still are Christians, not Muslim. And during that time, I became very aware of the massive injustices suffered by Palestinians who I think what you can see in the West Bank and Gaza, well, in Gaza you see now a complete apocalypse. What you can see in the West Bank today is the closest thing we have to remind us what colonialism in India must once have been like, the degree to which people can be subjected, oppressed, deprived of their lives. And I came back from that experience to write 4 books in India about colonialism, very much inspired by an awareness that I'd gained there of what colonialism actually feels like in the present day, and looking far more critically at British history in India than I had previously done. It in a sense, made me aware of how a colonial power can oppress, take land, ignore the sentiments of local people, exploit a country and its resources. And this is stuff that elsewhere in the world generally ended in the 1940s. We live in a post-colonial world, and following the success of Indian independence, obviously the whole of Africa and much of the rest of the world shed themselves of colonial subjection. But it continues in a very pointed form to this day in the West Bank, and it's accelerating with the support of the West.
Tell me, when is this book on the Palestinian people that you're proposing to write likely to come out?
I'm not even sure I'm going to be writing it, Karan, but it is something that's obsessing me at the moment. At the moment, as you know, I do this podcast, the Empire podcast, and I'm at the moment deep in the research for a long series on the history of Gaza, which is going to happen. That's going to be out in the next 6 weeks. And in the course of reading for this, I feel that it would be wrong, in a sense, to be writing about any other period of history than the period of than the colonial history of Palestine, because this is something which is so current and so painful. And certainly in the part of the world that I'm from, in Britain, very few people understand how far British imperial policy is responsible for the mess today. I don't think that
I'll come to all of that in a moment's time, because that is precisely what that amazing speech we've just heard is all about. But let me first ask you, how would you describe the present situation, both for the Palestinian people in Gaza as well as the Palestinian people in the West Bank? In Gaza, nearly 60,000 have been killed. Pretty close to 130,000 have been injured, and the Strip is devastated. In the West Bank, Israeli settlers are steadily and increasingly encroaching upon and pushing out Palestinian inhabitants. So how would you describe what's happened in both places?
Well, they're very different situations, obviously. Gaza has always been a much more crowded and difficult place than the West Bank. Gaza, which historically has an extraordinary past. I don't think many people are necessarily aware that, you know, for example, in the 4th and 5th century, Gaza had a school of rhetoric, a university, a library that was the equal of the Alexandria Library. What Nalanda was to India and Indian history, the School of Gaza was for early, for 4th, 5th century Byzantium. And this place was filled with refugees in 1948 and is one of the most crowded places on earth before all this latest round of trouble. Now, as you say, it's been completely devastated, and there's a concerted Israeli policy to push all Palestinians into what they call a humanitarian zone, but which the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert described only yesterday as a concentration camp, and clearly designed to be so brutal and so difficult to live in that people will choose to leave it. It is basically a policy of ethnic cleansing. Now, things are not quite as bad as that on the West Bank, and the West Bank is very different to that. When you first visit it, I think people are often surprised because they only normally catch glimpses of the West Bank when it's on the news headlines, and you get the impression of a place where settlers and villagers are battling it out on a daily basis. In fact, it's a very large area. It's much more sparsely populated than Gaza, and it's incredibly beautiful. It looks, anyone that's ever been on holiday in Tuscany where you have hilltop villages with olive groves over gorgeous white stone hills, will be aware of a landscape very similar. It's the classic Mediterranean landscape with vines, olive groves, beautiful villages, incredibly ancient churches and mosques. Many of the villages around Jerusalem are Christian and keep churches that are some of the oldest in the world from the 3rd, 4th, 5th century, such as the village of Taipei, which was recently raided by villagers. And that's a very different environment to Gaza. But there's a concerted policy, and there has been since 1967, to fill this Palestinian landscape with newly arrived Israeli settlers, many of them from Brooklyn or from Russia. When I was there in the 1990s, there were huge numbers of Russians escaping anti-Semitism in Russia, but imposing terrible apartheid on the Palestinians in the West Bank. And it is, again, a system of colonialism which Indians will be familiar from their history books. Just as on the Simla Mall, there was that famous notice saying "No dogs or Indians," and in many British clubs, no Indians were allowed for many years. So in the West Bank, there is a double system whereby there are smart new roads which are available to Israelis who have yellow number plates and drive in very quickly and speedily from Israeli cities. And then there are the old roads which are potholed and neglected, which are the only ones that the Palestinians are allowed to use. And so there's a very clear system of apartheid. Israelis can settle in the new settlements wherever they like, but Palestinians are restricted to their old villages and the one or two towns which dot the West Bank hills. They're now hemmed in by checkpoints. Often you have to queue for 3 or 4 hours to get out. If you work in Ramallah, for example, and wish to go to Jerusalem, you now need a permit. But even if you get the permit and you're working in Jerusalem, it can take 3 or 4 hours in the morning to queue to get through these turnstiles, be checked, like going into an airport. But the system is deliberately discriminatory and harassing. And you see young Israeli soldiers lounging around making comments at young Palestinians. So it is, to my eyes, the nearest thing surviving in this world of the sort of colonial subjugation faced by Indians under British rule. Today, it's the Israelis doing it to the indigenous Palestinians. And I should perhaps explain, because maybe people in India don't understand this, the Palestinians are a mixture of all the different peoples who've ever really passed through that area of the Middle East in history. They're not just Bedouin from the desert who came from Saudi Arabia in the 7th century, although there was many who did drift in at that time. But archaeology and DNA studies show that the modern Palestinian population have very, very similar DNA to the kind of people that were living in that region as early as the Bronze Age. Okay. And so these people have always been there. Many of them have exactly the same DNA as modern Jewish Israelis, and they are cousins. They're people who converted from Judaism first to Christianity and Islam. So these are also absolutely indigenous people, and they have their rights, and they need a state.
Absolutely. Against that marvelous background, let's come to your speech, because in a very your speech takes us into history. You say by the end of 1948. 85% of the Palestinian people had been ethnically cleansed. This is what they call the Nakba. We know very little about it in India. Can you tell me a little bit more?
Sure. So from the same sort of period that the Mughals ruled northern India, that area of the Middle East was ruled from Istanbul by the Ottoman Empire. In 1917, Indian troops were among those who helped defeat the Ottoman army outside Gaza. There were 3 battles of Gaza, and it was the Bikaner Camel Corps, as well as other Indian troops and some from New Zealand and Australia under General Allenby, that led the great last cavalry charge in history, and defeated the same Ottoman troops who had previously defeated the British at Gallipoli. 7 days after the Ottomans had been defeated outside Gaza by Indian troops, and the British had walked into Jerusalem, the Balfour Declaration was announced, and it said that the British government viewed with favour the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And it then promised that nothing would be done to erode the civil or religious liberties of the non-Jewish inhabitants of Palestine. Now, two things there. First of all, Balfour and Churchill and Lloyd George, all these people who had come up with this in the cabinet in 1917, none of them at that point had ever visited Palestine, had no idea what was going on there. And their only knowledge was from their biblical studies, where, of course, there is a large Jewish population. The reality was that in 1917, when the Balfour Declaration was issued, only 10% of Palestine was Jewish, 10% was Christian, and 80% was Palestinian Muslim. And very rapidly, in the 1920s, 1930s, and early 1940s, there was massive emigration, a lot of it accelerated by the rise of Hitler and the flight of Jews from persecution in Germany, but also from Russia. And this immigrant population that had only been 10% of the population in 1917 rose to about, I think, 40% by 1948. At that point, at the end of the Second World War, the British, in the same, exactly 1 year after their departure from India, and for similar reasons, that the British were bankrupt at the end of World War II and no longer had either the resources or the energy to continue colonial entanglement when Britain was a ruin after the Blitz and exhausted after the war with Nazi Germany. The British just withdrew, making absolutely no provision to protect the Palestinians. Now, in the 1930s, there'd been a massive revolt called the Arab Revolt, or the Palestinian Revolt, against British policy, which was allowing this vast immigration, this rapid immigration of an often hostile Jewish population who bought up land, threw off the peasants working there. There was a law, that the Jewish agency, that no Jewish land could employ Arabs. So the local people, many of whom were tenants of large aristocratic families living abroad in places like Beirut, would wake up one day and found that the farm that they'd been farming for 200 or 300 years had suddenly been bought up by newly arrived immigrants, and they were thrown off the land. And in the 1930s, there was this major revolt, the Arab Revolt. The British put it down very brutally. Again, Indians know a thing or two about how brutal British responses to uprisings could be, as 1957. Sorry again. Indians know a thing or two. Indians know a thing or two about how brutal British responses to uprisings could be, as the response to the First War of Independence, 1857, shows. And the British shelled villages, bombed it. There are some reports of the use of poison gas by aerial, just dropped by planes and villages.
And all of this is the background to the Nakba, is it?
So by the time that the British fled from Palestine, and it was a very unseemly departure, a year after the British had left India, the Palestinian leadership had been exiled abroad. The Palestinian people had been entirely disarmed, while the newly arrived Jewish immigrants had been both trained and armed by the British. So you had a very unequal situation in 1948. And while neighboring Arab countries did attempt to come to the aid of the Palestinians, by the end of 1948, most Palestinians had been kicked off their land. And a whole world disappeared. I mean, it's an extraordinary thought that every business, every house, every institution that had been there before was vanished, and a whole population were displaced.
What you write of the Nakba, you say the Nakba happened because politicians in this country, and by this country you mean Britain, enabled it to happen. The truth is, Palestinians were regarded as expendable and unimportant. Was this just ignorance? That they hadn't visited, they didn't know the situation, and therefore they were ignorant, or was it also racism?
It was a bit of both. I mean, there was a major commission. I mean, there were many government investigations because, of course, there was massive complaints about the Balfour Declaration and the fact that this population from largely Russia, Poland, and Germany, was suddenly flooding into this territory, which previously had been 90% Palestinian. In one of the commissions, the Peel Commission in 1937, Winston Churchill made a terrible statement which revealed the degree of racism. He says, "I do not regret that the black people of Australia have been kicked out by a higher grade race. I do not regret that the Red Indians of North America, as he called them, have given way to a higher grade, a better, a more worldly wide race. The same is true of the Palestinians. Just because a dog has laid in a manger, it does for a very long time, it does not necessarily have a right to that manger." It's well worth Googling the speech, Winston Churchill on the Palestinians, because what it shows is that not only did Churchill have complete contempt and a racist attitude, I mean, a deeply and profoundly racist attitude to the Palestinians, who he regarded basically as savages, who had no rights. But it also shows that Churchill was espousing the sort of racial hierarchy that we normally associate with the Nazis, that he thought it was okay that, as he put it, a higher grade race, a stronger race, a more worldly race, those are his words, should come and take their place. In sort of Churchill's 1937 view, the fact that the Jewish people were better educated, were more organized, were more developed in terms of their economics and their abilities, meant that it was a good thing that these, quote, savages should be kicked out. And that's indeed what happened in 1948.
In fact, you hold Britain more responsible than any other country for what's happened to the Palestinian people. In your speech, you said, and I'm quoting you, "This country has a historic responsibility more than virtually any other to see the establishment of a Palestinian state and to provide protection for the Palestinian people." But the truth, William Dalrymple, is that responsibility has not been recognized by any British government since the creation of Israel in 1948. No British government has accepted that they have this responsibility.
Yes, I mean, I think the reason that this speech went viral in Britain is that how much this has been forgotten here. I mean, people are vaguely aware. I mean, I don't need to tell an Indian audience how ignorant the British are of their own history, and any Indian that's ever been to Britain and tried to have a conversation about the Raj will be aware of the degree of rosy-tinted visions and ignorance about the reality of British colonialism. But this is particularly strong in the case of Palestine, where there's much less awareness that the British were ever there at all. Never mind that they took a country that had a 90% Palestinian population and turned it into a state from a completely different ethnic group collected from around the world. And so my plea in the speech was that there has to be a Palestinian state alongside an Israeli state. There clearly now has to be a two-state solution, in my view, which has always been the obvious solution. The West Bank has a great deal of room. The Jewish settlers who've been moved in, many of them under the governments of Benjamin Netanyahu over the last 20, 30 years, have only recently been erected. It would not be an impossible thing at all to get rid of those settlers and to place the Palestinians there. Instead, Netanyahu's government, which is the most extreme in Israel's history, with a large number of extreme ultranationalist groups led by figures like Smotrich and Ben Gvir, are far from wanting some sort of moderate, shared future with the Palestinians. They are doing their best to ethnically cleanse them by seizing Palestinian land, terrorizing Palestinians on the West Bank, and by shepherding the entire population of Gaza into this new concentration camp and make conditions there so difficult that the 2.1 million Palestinians in Gaza will have no option but to emigrate.
But you go one step further. You say that not only has Britain refused to accept its historic responsibility to establish a Palestinian state, In addition, repeated British governments have been, as you put it, complicit with the most public and visible of war crimes.
That the war crimes is what's been happening in the last 2 years, and the British government of Keir Starmer continues the policy of Rishi Sunak's Conservative government of selling arms to Israel and keeping very warm diplomatic relations with Netanyahu's government. But long before that, for the previous 80 years since 1948. There has been a succession of governments which have wished to keep very good relations with Israel and have done very little to live up to that original promise of Balfour that alongside a Jewish homeland, again, to use the quotes of the Balfour Declaration, nothing shall be done to erode the rights, civil and religious rights of the non-Jewish inhabitants of Palestine. We created this mess. We brought these immigrants from abroad into Palestine, but we did nothing to, either at the time, to help the Palestinians, and we did a great deal to undermine them, and have done nothing since to really put any significant pressure on Israel, or to help persuade America to put pressure on Israel to have a Palestinian state alongside the state of Israel within its 1967 borders.
Let me pick up on that promise that Balfour made, which you referred to a moment ago. I'm quoting that promise from what you said in your speech. Nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Was that just politically correct rhetoric? Did he not mean to live up to it? Because he did absolutely nothing to live up to it, and none of his successors did either.
Yes, there were private assurances given around the time of the Balfour Declaration that this, in a sense, watered down promise of a Jewish homeland rather than a Jewish state did actually mean eventually the creation of a Jewish state. That was said privately by Balfour and Lloyd George, his prime minister, in meetings at that time, and that's recorded in diaries of the time. But the public declaration was only for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And as late as the 1930s, Winston Churchill was saying that was the definition, that it was a Jewish homeland within Palestine, not a Jewish state which would supplant Palestine. Anyway, in a sense, that horse has long fled the stable. The key now is to find some sort of political solution which will look after the large numbers of Palestinians. Just to give the figures, there are 2.1 million Palestinians in Gaza. There are 4 million Palestinians in the West Bank. Now, those together make 6.1. Within Israel, there are, I can't remember the exact figures. Is it 8 million Jewish Israelis and 1 million Palestinian, what the Israelis call Israeli Arabs, because they don't like to use the word Palestinian. So there are large populations here, 2.1 million in Gaza, 4 million in the West Bank, that under this present Israeli government look to become ethnically cleansed, to be driven out, and to lose all their rights. There's also even some in Netanyahu's government who want to drive out the Israeli Arabs, who have full. They're the very small minority that were left within the state of Israel after the Nakba in 1948, who have full Israeli citizenship, right to vote in elections and so on. Although they're discriminated against in many, many ways, they are still Israeli passport holders. And even their future is not secure. Further, I think it's 1 million of them now face the possibility of losing their rights. So in all, there is, if the West does not put pressure on America, if the global South does not stand up in the United Nations and support these people, there could be as much as 2.1 plus 4, that's 6, plus 1 in Israel, 7 million Palestinians who will find themselves ethnically cleansed, without rights, and refugees.
In fact, those terms, ethnically cleansed and genocide, are part of the language you use in your speech. You do believe this is ethnic cleansing. You do believe this is genocide.
It's certainly ethnic cleansing, that's absolutely clear. The term genocide is more contested, and I didn't use it, I have to say, for the first couple of years, because genocide implies the wiping out of an entire people. But that's now a term I do use, and it's now clearly the policy of Netanyahu's government to expel and get rid of the entire Palestinian population. And that's a term now being used by groups like Amnesty International, by Human Rights Watch, many in the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, says there is a plausible accusation of genocide leveled against Israel. And so it certainly, whether you want to call it mass slaughter or whether you want to call it genocide, there's certainly a policy of mass killings going on. Every day we're seeing 100, sometimes more, sometimes less, Palestinians killed, many of them as they queue for basic supplies, with this horrible new gang of mercenaries who are giving food to the starving people of Gaza. It's an indescribably horrible situation, and one that one hopes that India will stand up and take a strong moral point on too. I understand
Before we come to India, let me ask you one more question about the British response to the crisis in Palestine. To what extent does the problem lie in the fact, because you alluded to this earlier, that the British people are ignorant of the truth, that Palestine and the Palestinian problem has never been taught in their schools? They are simply unaware of the role British governments have played in creating and exacerbating the problem.
That's absolutely the case. There is literally no mention of Britain's role in Palestine at any point in our education system. I have to say that our education system is incredibly Anglo-centric. The kind of thing kids learn in school is Henry VIII and his wives, Florence Nightingale in the Crimea, and then Churchill fighting the Nazis. The British Empire hardly comes into it at all. It's got slightly better in the last few years, but it's still the whole history of the British in India, for example, is only very glancingly touched upon. And smaller episodes like the British Mandate in Palestine are not touched on at all. So I don't think British people are aware, when they read the news bulletins, when they hear of settlers rampaging around West Bank villages, or the people of Gaza being bombed, or missiles flying between Iran and Israel. I don't think the British are at all aware of their responsibility for this crisis.
But beyond the ignorance of the British people, is there not also a distinct and definite bias in favor of Israel and the Jews? Recently, the BBC, for instance, refused to show a documentary on how doctors and hospitals are targeted by the Israeli Defense Force, and eventually the documentary was shown by Channel 4. Isn't that an illustration of how the British system tilts in favor of the Jews and against the Palestinians?
There's been very good education in the British system about Western anti-Semitism, and there is this long history of anti-Jewish racism going way back into the Middle Ages. There have been pogroms against Jews in cities like York, for example, in the 11th and 12th century, and this anti-Jewish feeling obviously reached its peak in the Holocaust in the Second World War, when up to 6 million Jews were gassed in the Holocaust. Now, the British people do know about that, and there are many excellent Hollywood movies which tell the story. There are many brilliant novels as well, and the Holocaust is something that the British are very well versed about, which creates an imbalance. We know about the terrible things that the Jewish people have suffered, and they are utterly terrible, but we don't know anything about the Nakba. There's never been a good Nakba movie. There's never been a great Nakba novel that has particularly sort of penetrated the British consciousness or won the Booker Prize. And so it's a tragedy which is not understood here. Our political class, I think, are completely ignorant of it. I think if you were to go into Parliament and do a poll of MPs today about what is the Nakba, I suspect that less than half of them would ever have heard of them. If you did it on the streets of Britain, probably 1% would have heard of them, would have heard of it. And so there's a great ignorance about the Palestinian history, and yes, that translates under the present government to very full diplomatic and even military and intelligence support for Israel, and
But you're seriously telling me this is ignorance and not prejudice?
I think it's more ignorance than prejudice, is my impression. I think there may be elements of prejudice there too, but I mean, there's also prejudice against Jewish people still very much alive in Britain too. So there, this is not this is a world where the British don't show themselves best, I'm afraid.
Finally, how would you view India's attitude and response to what's happening in Gaza and to the Palestinian people? You started to refer to it. I stopped you earlier. Here's your chance.
Well, obviously, I'm British. I'm not Indian, though I've lived in India for most of the last 40 years, and so I'm speaking as a foreigner. But my impression is that the Nehruvian governments of the early years of independence were very wholehearted in their support of the Palestinians. Both Nehru and Gandhi believed that a great injustice had been done to the Palestinians. And Nehru in particular pushed for recognition of the Palestinians. There was a Palestinian embassy in India very early on. And it's only with the rise of the BJP that an embassy of Israel was founded at all in Delhi. And then we've seen overwhelmingly a move from the BJP to ever greater closeness with Israel and support of Israel. That's not unconnected with the fact that Israel now supplies quite a lot of the weaponry for the Indian army. And since in the early days of the Ukraine war, some of the inadequacies of the Russian equipment was illustrated very dramatically in the failures of the Russian attack on Ukraine in the early years of that war, led many in India to switch to Israeli weapons supplies. Now, all this has created a situation where the Modi government, also wishing to promote this idea of a Middle Eastern economic corridor, and given also that figures like Adani have strong business interests in Israel and now own the Haifa port, has meant there's been a strong pro-Israel tilt in Indian policy. My impression, and I'm not an expert in Indian policy of the Indian government, but my impression was that at the early days of the post October the 7th, that India did vote in several resolutions supportive of a ceasefire. But I understand that has changed recently, and that the Modi government has not been urging a ceasefire on Israel and has effectively been covertly supporting the Netanyahu government.
Are you disappointed? A quick answer.
Yes, I mean that would not be the policy. I'm not an Indian, so this is not my decision to make in a sense. But certainly, as an outsider who has always been very impressed by the foreign policy decisions made by India, and which have often been more moral than those of my own country, I was very disappointed to see India swing into a more pro-Israel position at a time when Israel is very plausibly accused of committing a major genocide and is apparently preparing to ethnically cleanse up to 6 or 7 million people from its land.
William Dalrymple, thank you very much for the time you've given me. And thank you for talking about that speech that has gone viral, not just in Britain, but in India as well. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you, Karan.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.